Well, hey, good morning. I can't wait to start this series called Faith Forward. As we do, I'm going to tell you most of this is going to come out of Deuteronomy chapter 6. So if you want to open your Bibles and get ahead of me, you can get to Deuteronomy chapter 6 now. And we'll spend some good time throughout the series in this particular chapter of the Bible. But as we do, I want to talk a little bit about where we're headed in this series. We're talking about Faith Forward, which is about imparting faith. If you want a definition for impartation, it might be something like this: passing something you have to someone else. Passing something that you have to somebody else. And so we can see impartation in a lot of ways, especially in families. We can see some really clear examples of imparting priorities, imparting values. Some of those things might be things like this. You know, you need to finish your plate. Anybody grow up in a home where finish your plate was a big deal? Yes, probably it came from grandma and grandpa who lived through the Great Depression. There's no joke, right? And it was passed on to their kids, and it was passed on to you. Finish your plate is a big deal. Why? Because there was a season and a time when we didn't have food on the plate, and the food on the plate was a really, really big deal. And so you don't waste food. So these things get passed on from generation to generation. Some other things that we might pass on, things like show up on time. How many of you have a family culture like, hey, show up on time was a big deal to your family? How many of you had a family culture where show up on time was not a big deal to your family or to your parents? Yeah, so you can be honest. It's all right. So yeah, okay, all right, yeah. Things like love for USC and disdain for the Bruins. Things like Dodgers for life. You know, these are the important things of life that you want to pass on, that you want to impart to the next generation. But I have an important question. Hopefully you know what the answer is. Is it possible to impart faith in the next generation? We might say, well, faith it's personal, right? It's about you and God. And we would say, yes, it is also very personal. But because something is personal doesn't mean it is not possible to impart faith. How do we impart faith? Let me give you an example. I've shared the story in the past, and let me just give you a little example. In the past, I remember my older boy was probably about 8 or 9, maybe 10, somewhere in that stage. And I think it was a report card or something that he was getting some credit for, and great-grandpa pulled out some money. And he had this premeditated plan that none of us knew about, but he pulled out some money, and he had $21 bills. Now, this was quite a bit of time ago. My son is now almost 23. And so he was younger, and $20 meant more. It was more than just one burrito at Taco Bell like it is today. So it could get you more back then. But he counted it out, $21 bills. Like, wow, that's like a lot. He kind of fanned it out and he gave it to him, and we were like, yay, that's awesome. And he was, his eyes were wide, like, this is a lot of money. I'm so excited, And he looks at it, and then my grandpa did something we did not expect. And he pulled out his wallet and said, hey, I'll trade you. And he didn't tell any of us that he was about to do this, so this was just all on the cuff, and I'll trade you. And so my son's now looking at me going, is this a trick? Right? Is this a test? What is this? I don't want to be the fool who, right, traded this $20 for some lousy old leather wallet. Like, I don't want to. And so he's looking at me for an indication of what to do. And I look at him, and here's what I know. This is what I knew in the moment. I had no idea it was coming, but this is what I knew. I know my grandfather, his great-grandfather. I know my grandfather. And this is what I know. He'll never take from you. Ever. He only wants to do you good. He loves to bless his family. And he'll never take from you. So I don't know what's in the wallet either, but this is much I know. You can trust him that there's a good intention. And so he's looking at me, his father, and deciding whether or not to take his great-grandfather's offer. And I say to him, by my face, like, whatever this is, you can trust him. Like, give it a go. And so he does. He takes the $20 singles and gives it back and gets the wallet and opens it. And there's a 20 in it, and I think maybe another $1 or $2 in it. And he's also got a wallet. And sure enough, he didn't lose anything. He gained a little, got a little more. But what was happening in the moment was I was imparting faith. There was something he didn't know. Faith is the evidence of things not seen, the substance of things we hope for, right? The evidence of things not seen. And so he didn't know what the intentions were. He didn't know how all of this would play out, but this is what he knew. He looked at me and I said, you can trust him. And I just want to say to every person in this room, you have the ability to impart faith to the next generation. By the way you live, by the way you speak, by the way you intentionally go about sharing your faith, sharing the stories, imparting what God's done in your life to the next generation, what you do is you impart faith. And they may not know him the way you know him. They may not have experienced what you've experienced, but what you're doing is teaching them God can be trusted. So my question, is it possible to impart faith? The answer is a resounding yes, and God says a lot about it. This series will not only talk about why that's so important, but it's important. It's critical. You realize you're one generation away all the time from a generation growing up that doesn't know the Lord. One generation away. And the difference is how we impart faith from one generation to the next. It's what we want to put a spotlight on in this series. And so that's what we're talking about today. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Here's what I'm going to do. I need to set it up for you, and then I'm going to read the whole, big chunk, 25 verses, so you see the whole context. I want you to catch it all. And then today, we're only going to talk about a small portion of verses, all right? And so we'll unpack those. So we're not going to unpack all 25 verses. We're just going to unpack a small section as we go. But throughout this series, we'll be going in and out of this passage. But for context, Deuteronomy, it's the last of the 5 books that Moses wrote. It's called the Pentateuch, the last of the first 5 books of the Bible. And Moses wrote this, but Deuteronomy was written at the end of Moses' life. So, where you read Exodus and the stories of God showing up to Moses and what happens and how God leads the people from Egypt, out of Egypt and into Israel. Deuteronomy takes place after they once got to the promised land, failed to get into the promised land because they doubted God, that he was big enough, strong enough, that he was going to actually be able to bring them into the land. So then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That generation that doubted God all died out, except for 2, Joshua and Caleb, who said, God can do it. I trust him. And now here they are again at the edge of the promised land. Moses knows he can't go in. God's already told him, you're not going in. And so Moses is giving Deuteronomy, it's his final words again. It's his remind you of everything words again. It's before I'm gone and before you go, let's remember what God has said. Let's remember the promises. Let's remember your story. Let's remember what God has already done. And let's remember his ways and why they matter and are key to you succeeding in the promises of God. Let's remember that. That's the book of Deuteronomy. So you understand the context of where it's coming and why it's coming. And now, Deuteronomy 6, let me read these 25 verses and then we'll break it down a little bit. So Moses is giving another sermon. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you're going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your sons' sons, by keeping all his statutes, his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. That's the backdrop. The backdrop to what he's saying. Again, the picture is this. God has promised you a particular land and a particular blessing, and within that place, he wants you to live long and to prosper. All right? That's what he wants. See, a little Star Trek humor for somebody who gets it, all right? He wants you to live long and prosper in the land, but he's also told you if you don't obey, if you don't walk with God in the land, you won't live long in the land and prosper. And so I'm telling you, this is what I want for you. I want good for you, God is saying. I have great in store for you. I have promises in store for you. I'm going to do this. You can count on me for this, and this. So let's go. That's the backdrop. You succeeding in life. You thriving in who God's made you to be. You stepping into all of the destiny and promises and purposes of God for your life, for your family's life, for your children's life, for your grandchildren's life. That's the backdrop of this. If that doesn't get you going, I want to hear what he got to say. And I want my kids to know what he said. I want my grandkids to know what he said. That's what we're after. That's the backdrop. Continuing on. Verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You're to own them. You're to own these words. These aren't words for you to stick in your head. These are words for you to know in your heart, to own them, to love them, to know them, to live them in your heart. You shall teach them diligently. Say diligently. This is going to be our main area that we're looking at today. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. In a moment, I'm going to tell you the title of this first one is intentional. And this is why. Do you see how intentional Moses is reminding them they must be about what God has said? Intentional about how they teach, how they remind. Intentional. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him shall you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of America, the gods of capitalism, the gods of whatever's happening right now on Instagram, Facebook, and you name it. You shall not pursue all the other gods that are out there, the gods of the peoples who are around you. For the Lord your God in your midst is a jealous God. Lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you and he destroy you from the face of the earth. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his testimonies and his statutes, which he has commanded you. And you shall do what is right and what is good in the sight of the Lord, that it may go well with you. And that you may go in and take possession of the good land that the Lord swore to give your fathers by thrusting out all of your enemies before you, as the Lord has promised. And when your son asks you in time to come, What is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded you? You shall say to your son, we were slaves. We were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders, great and grievous, against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before your eyes, before our eyes. And he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always. To fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. And last verse. And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God has commanded us. This series from this passage will be in 3 parts. Part 1 will be intentional, is called Be Intentional About Impartation. Part 2 will be generational about impartation. And part 3 will be urgent about impartation. That's where we're going to go in the series. Today, we're going to look at verses 4 through 9, and we're going to talk about being intentional about impartation. We need to impart faith to the next generation. We need to impart faith, and to do that must be intentional. It cannot be happenstance. And we realize that we are fighting right now, parents, many of you are fighting against a prevailing culture when it comes to things of religion that tells you, don't push. Don't try to impart to your kids. Let them decide for themselves. Figure it out on their own. And some of that came as a reaction to people, a generation feeling pushed, forced to go to church on Sunday, you name it. Some of that has come as a secular response to just kind of the way that we process life today. It's up to everybody to figure out your own way. But what it has lost is the value and the importance placed on us to impart to the next generation what God has said and what God has done so they grow up with faith in him. He can be trusted. Are you with me? And so recognize we're up against some of those forces, those currents, and that's why intentional is so important. So 3 things that come out of this passage: intentional rhythms, intentional conversations, and intentional lifestyle. These 3 things come right out of this passage that we're going to be reading: intentional rhythms, intentional conversations, and intentional lifestyle. So let me read those verses again. From verse 4 to 9, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. By the way, it doesn't sound anything like, here is a religious system for you to follow. The beginning of this, the backdrop of this is you shall love. How do you like the word love? Love. Is that a religious word? No, that's a relational word. And we're invited to love the Lord, our God, with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, with everything we got, all our strength. Love the Lord your God. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. There's a word here where the picture of intentional comes from for me. The word is, you shall teach them diligently, is how it is written here in English. And it's one word. And that particular word has a few different meanings as you look it up in the Hebrew, and it has to do with sharpening a sword or sharpening something. It has to do with the idea of teaching them diligently or to repeat. And The picture here is how many teachers in the house? Anybody going to school right now in the house? Okay, you'll catch this picture, but you know, the number 2 pencil and the Scantron. Remember those? And so before you were to take your test and do your Scantron, you needed to have your number 2 pencil sharpened. You know, because what happens, right? You use your pencil a lot, and then what takes place? It gets dull. And so what do you have to do? You got to go back to the sharpener. You got to go back to the... How come those never work for me, by the way? They always mess up the lead. And it's like wood to one spot and like a little bit of lead show. Why does that happen to me? And then other people put it in and it works perfect. I'm like, how is it magic that you hold it a certain way and it works? I don't know. Anyways, anybody else like me? Like, just those things were a pain. I don't know what they were. They didn't like me. Or you use a knife. Any chefs in the house, right? You're cutting things. Any chefs in the house? Be proud. Raise your hand high. Come on, chefs in the house. Yeah, well, you know, some of you need, yes, I know, there's a real chef. Okay, well, what happens to the knives after a while? They get dull. You have to put them back through the sharpener, right? So then it goes right to the little, you can do the little chop thing and it actually works. Imagine that's the picture here. When he says teach them diligently, it is resharpen them through repeating. The picture is this. Say it again. Say it again. Tell them again. Remind them again. Don't let them forget. Because what happens? Things get dull. Stories get dull. The lessons get dull. We forget. Anybody forget in here? Right? So what do? Sharpen it. Put it back in the pencil thing. Let's do it again. Let's remember the stories. Let's remember the goodness of God. Sharpen it, sharpen it, sharpen it, sharpen it, sharpen it. Remember, repeat, repeat, repeat again and again. And that kind of intentionality is how we can impart faith. So he says this about intentional rhythms in verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children. Sharpen, sharpen, repeat. Talk of them when you sit in your house. And when you walk by the way, and when you lie down and when you rise. And he gives us in this little verse such wisdom, a daily rhythm. And do you see the rhythm of the life? Super simple. What does he mean when you sit down? Well, they didn't sit in front of a TV back then. When do you sit down in your house? You sit down to eat at the meal. When you sit down, how many times are you sitting down as a family? At least a couple times a day. Maybe breakfast, maybe dinner. But when you sit down together, sharpen. You can do that every day. And then it says, when you walk by the way. Now, most of us don't walk a lot. What do? We're driving now, right? We're driving by the way. But what happens? You're in the car together. You're in the car together. Use the time. Sharpen it. Use the moments for sharpening. You're in the car together driving to school. What are you talking about? After school, what are you picking up? What are you talking about? We have these opportunities when you're moving about. You guys are on a long road trip with a bunch of friends. What do you talk about? There are opportunities to sharpen. And then lastly, he says, when you lie down and when you rise up. The bedtimes, right? Right before bed. These are rhythms in our life every day. And so he mentions these everyday kind of rhythms. In fact, the tools that you're going to be getting throughout the series, one each week, this one is for the car. So when you're driving, you can put it in the visor or wherever. And so you have the remembrance of questions, stick it in your cup holder, you pull it out. These are questions for us to talk about while we're driving. But you've got that one. There's going to be one for the mealtime, and there's going to be one for bedtime. Just tools that we can use as we go. These are daily rhythms, but God also established monthly rhythms for Israel. Things to observe weekly, things to observe monthly, things to observe yearly. These were rhythms that were built into the fabric of their culture for the purpose of what? Intentionally sharpening, intentionally remembering, repeating, so they would stay sharp. So faith would be passed on. What are your personal rhythms? What are the family rhythms that you guys have? Everybody has these rhythms to some degree, and so can we be intentional? Could you be more intentional about the rhythms you already have? and how we use those to impart faith. What do your rhythms, your daily rhythms, reveal about your priorities, about your faith, and about your intentionality? There's some rhythms where it's like, wake up, throw on ESPN, right? Walk in the house, throw on ESPN. There's like a knee-jerk reaction to throw on ESPN in my house. Like, sports. I'm in the house, sports are on. And so if I'm not intentional about how I spend the morning, I'll get up, phone, start getting into my day. What's happening today? Okay, this, that, the other thing. All right, what emails are waiting for me? And certainly, what time do the Dodgers play today? Oh, and who's injured? And when are they coming back? And wait, okay, my fantasy league, are they all right? Is this the right thing? Do I need to go and get somebody else? And boy, just like that. What's the news? What's happening in the world? Oh, what did she say? What did he say? What did they say? Who says what? Man, I'm mad. Well, good morning to you too. Intentional. If you're not intentional, you have opportunities. So think about your rhythms. Secondly, he talks about intentional conversations. So we've got these things, we've got these rhythms. We're going to be going to bed. So how do we use the time? We're going to be driving in the car. How could we use the time? We're going to be sitting around meals. Well, what do we actually talk about in those things? He says intentional. These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them and you shall talk of them. Well, what do we talk about? And in this long passage, why I read to you all of it is what I wanted you to understand. 3 things he's talking about in this passage of chapter 6 that we talk about. The intentional conversations. We talk about God's ways, what God has said is true. We talk about that. Kids might be watching something. You guys might be talking about something that happened in the day, and the kids might be trying to process that, or friends of yours might be trying to process something. You say, well, what does God say about that? Or, hey, this language, in our family, we don't talk like that. Simple little things. Well, how do we talk? Well, we talk like this. Why? Because God says to talk like this to each other. Like, this is helpful. This is right. So we talk about God's ways or his truths. We talk about God's promises. What has he promised? What did God promise us? What's available to us? What did God say about already who he is and what he's ready to do in our lives? Let's talk about the promises of God for our life. And let's talk about the stories, the testimonies. Share the stories, share the testimonies. Talk about those things. What has God already done? Both in your family life, in your life, but also in the Bible. Those stories, bring them back up. Remember what God has already done. Retell the stories. Tell them again. I've already told that one. Tell them again. Tell them again. Tell the stories. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Be intentional. These are stories that when we hear them, they build faith. One of our family stories that gets told a lot. You've already heard me tell it, some of you. And I'll tell it again. I'm going to repeat. But it marked our family that way back when, in the 60s, when the Watts riots broke out, I believe it was the 60s. I looked all this up. When the Watts riots broke out, we had a manufacturing plant down in the Torrance area, right off Avalon Boulevard, right dead smack in the middle of the action. But they broke out, and my grandpa had made a commitment to go on a retreat with the Royal Rangers. That was like Boy Scouts, kind of like in the church mixing together. That's what Royal Rangers is. And so he had promised to take some guys, some kids out for that. And the Watts riots broke out, and the city was burning. They were lighting fires, stores were being burned, companies were being burned down. It was just absolute, it was just a rough time. And so people called my grandpa and they said, hey, are you going to cancel, right? You're going to cancel, you're not going to do this Royal Ranger thing, right? Because the Watts riots and your company's down there and all that. And my grandpa said, the company belongs to the Lord. There's nothing I can do by staying here. I've already given my word. We're going to go on this Royal Ranger retreat. And so sure enough, the Watts riots went throughout. There was multiple days it was going on, and factories were being burned all around. And he came back from the retreat having no idea what was going to be left of the company when it was all done. And come to find out, well, as you know, the National Guard was deployed. I think some 14,000 National Guard were deployed to help kind of bring peace back to the whole thing and quell the crazy that was going on. And in that, they had set up a machine gun turret in the lobby of their building. Their company, their building was the only building standing on the entire block. Everything else had been burned down. And we have this story in our family line that's just trust God. Like, God can be trusted. Had it burned or had it not burned, still, God can be trusted. He can rebuild. The point is, who do we trust? And so when the world is burning around us, where do we go as a family? We go to God. And so you hear these stories growing up. Where do you go as a family? We go to God. What do we do? We've given our word and seek first the kingdom. Oh, this is what it looks like. There's priorities God has. We're going to keep those priorities. What? Those are stories. Tell your stories. You've got stories. Share those stories. 1 Corinthians 10 says, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. And he was referring to parts of Israel's story and their history, even as he was writing these things, and what they tell about God, but also what they remind us about. And he's saying this had a reason then, but it has a purpose of being written down now. Retell the stories. You wonder, does Daniel in the lion's den have any impact on my kid going to school today? Yes. Because Daniel in the lion's den happened, and God revealed himself in a certain way to Daniel, that he's a God who can be trusted. And through that, to King Darius, that Daniel's God is a real God. So what does that mean to me? And you help them see those little pieces. You help yourself see those pieces. You remind yourself of the truth of God's promise for you. Are you with me? These stories, why do we tell them? We tell them because we can impart faith. When we don't know whether or not we can trust God with whatever, we have a story. And so my son, in that moment with grandpa and the wallet and the money, he was putting pieces together. Can I trust him? And I'm saying you can trust him by my face and my demeanor, like whatever this is, he's got good in store for you. And so he has to then take the leap, and then it becomes personal. So it was my faith. I knew what my grandpa would do. That became his faith when he took the leap. He had to take the leap, and then now it's his faith. Are you with me? But I imparted by saying you can trust him. And that stuff, those things have been imparted to us, to you. You can impart by what you say. I have a friend I've talked with, shared about him before, but he shared with me, he's an atheist, a really, really militant atheist, and we love to talk. We talk at Starbucks. And he actually shared with me his intention to impart his atheist faith to his children. And the way he did it. You know what he did? He used a table, and he invited all types of different religions to come and share their faith at the table with his kids. And he had preordained his script on how he was going to lambaste them in front of his kids and make them look like idiots and destroy his kids' faith in whatever religions are out there. That was his intention, and he did it. And he was sharing with me how proud he was. I did this, I had these guys come in, and I did this. And I had these ones come in, and then I did this again. And I had these ones come in, and I did this again. And he was so proud. He was imparting, intentionally imparting his faith, what he believed. If an atheist can do it, are you with me? How about us? How about you? That's what Deuteronomy 6 is about. Generations to come are going to need to hear the stories. They're going to need to hear the stories. You need to hear the stories, and your kids are going to need to hear the stories. And not only your kids, your friends, your roommates, your coworkers, your teammates, they need to hear the stories. You can impart faith. Share your faith. And then lastly, intentional lifestyle. Where do you get this from? Well, he says in verse 8, all these things that God has said, the law, the truths, the commandments, the stories, what do you do with them? Bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And all of a sudden, it comes into a picture, this picture of lifestyle. Look at these with me. The doorposts. What is he talking about? Your family culture. He's talking about your home life. These truths should have a readout right here. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, not by just what we say, but by our lifestyle, our family lifestyle, our home life says the same thing. This idea of lifestyle is everything that happens outside of Sunday church. Like when we're not here, how are we living? And he says, hey, listen, on the doorposts, right? When we go into that house belongs to the Lord. He lives among us. Let's live like our faith says. Oh, not only that, on the gates. As we're leaving the house and going out to the world, our public life should look like we trust in God. Are you with me? It should match that. Same faith. God has said, God has promised, and therefore, even though the company is struggling, even though this person's stabbing me in the back, even though we're going to have an election this year, even though, what do I know? God can be trusted. And so what do you experience? You experience me in my public life, the same as my Sunday life, as a man or a woman who can trust God, non-anxious presence, who knows my life is in his hands. My God is greater than whatever fear is trying to be shoved down your throat. And people experience you in your public life as someone who walks in the ways of the Lord, who talks in the ways like God would talk, not like the world talks, not like everybody in the office talks. My language, I live this out. And then also, he says, on your hands and between your eyes and the frontlets, we're talking about your private life. Everywhere I go, there I am. My lifestyle in private is the same as it is in public, as it is at home with my family, as it is at church on Sunday. It's about lifestyle. And if you live what you believe, if you live this, that same friend who is and says he's an atheist, said to me, Ryan, if I believed what you believed, because I had shared the gospel with him. We had some great challenges and conversations, and I shared with him what the Christian faith is, what my relationship with God is all about. And in the midst of that, one time he stopped me and he said, Ryan, if I believed what you believe, if that's actually true, I would be shouting it from the mountaintops. This is what he said. And I pray one day he does. And God meets him in that place. But our life is the same. It's our lifestyle. When people see the real stuff in you, it imparts faith. Just by being somebody who knows the Lord and follows the Lord and lives that consistent life. Listen, you may not be great at doing family devotions together. You may not feel like you know what to talk about in the car. This stuff might be a little new or awkward or things like that, or praying with your kids at night is a new thing. Great, we're all learning together. You may not be great at it. You don't even have to be great at it. But I will tell you this, if you're living this faith in front of them, that is the greatest thing you can possibly do. Because then they know, oh, Dad believes what he preaches. Mom believes what she preaches. When stuff hits the fan at home, they actually go to God. Oh, God is real. He's not an idea. This is not just a religion. Are you with me?